Negotiations between the US and Russia regarding the war in Ukraine have resumed, and there are signs that we are entering another negotiation cycle. Tomorrow, July 23 in Manila, at the ASEAN Foreign Ministers Forum, the head of the Russian Foreign Ministry, Sergei Lavrov, will meet with US Secretary of State Marco Rubio. These are the first face-to-face negotiations between the two ministers since September of last year. According to Lavrov, the topics will be Ukraine and the Anchorage understandings. Marco Rubio confirmed the meeting and explained why Washington is not cutting off contacts with Moscow. He says that Russia and the US, as the largest nuclear powers, cannot refuse to engage in dialogue. At the same time, Bloomberg, citing 3 sources close to the Kremlin, reported that Vladimir Putin has toughened his territorial demands on Ukraine. He no longer agrees to return a single piece of occupied land to Ukraine. He is demanding the entire Donbas. He intends to keep Donbas, as well as the captured areas of the Sumy and Kharkiv regions, as a buffer zone. And he will return to negotiations only after he has completely occupied the entire Donetsk region. By the way, the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation promised him it would do this by the end of this year. And the day before, the president of Azerbaijan, Ilham Aliyev, publicly exposed another communication channel in Baku from June 12 to 14. In July, a closed meeting of former high-ranking officials from Russia and Germany took place, where they discussed how to end the war without Azerbaijan's knowledge. And this makes it even more interesting. So let's discuss all of this together. My name is Alexei Pechi. Let's discuss these topics together. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel. We are moving towards the milestone of 300,000 subscribers, so I would be grateful for your personal subscription. So, the head of the Russian Foreign Ministry, Sergei Lavrov, himself announced today that he will hold talks with Marco Rubio on Thursday, July 23 in Manila on the sidelines of the ASEAN Foreign Ministers Forum. It's funny that now the Russians are once again trying to cling to the agreements in Anchorage, which, as you remember, actually didn't exist. Just yesterday, Bloomberg wrote that Russia believes the Anchorage agreements have lost their validity. Because of the tougher US stance on Ukraine, the Kremlin once again stated that in Alaska, the leaders of the US and Russia, Donald Trump and the dwarf Vladimir Putin, allegedly reached agreements that involve putting pressure on Ukraine, with the aim of giving up the Donetsk region in exchange for returning parts of the Sumy and Kharkiv regions to Russia. But let me remind you that Marco Rubio is followed by Sergei Lavrov. And after that, even Vladimir Putin himself publicly admitted in June that no agreements were actually reached in Anchorage. There was no spirit of Anchorage. Trump and Putin didn't agree on anything there. Let me emphasize again, Putin himself said this. He said, yes, there were no agreements. None of that happened. But a month passed, the wild Russians forgot all about it. And now Lavrov. Today Lavrov comes out with this. Quote, "We assume that, at least for now, our American colleagues have not yet refused their own proposals made in Anchorage, which were voiced and are now well known to everyone." That is, the Russians, with a straight face, are once again saying, listen, there were some agreements in Anchorage, so we've returned to them again. After all, they haven't completely turned us down. Once again, a month ago, this same Lavrov, Putin, he says, well, yes, there were no agreements. A month passes. Lavrov says, after all, we weren't denied those agreements, which didn't actually exist. And Lavrov also said that he is going to ask Marco Rubio about Donald Trump's predictions that a settlement in Ukraine is getting closer than before.
As for President Trump's predictions about a settlement getting closer, well, I'll ask Marco Rubio about it tomorrow. Especially since he also commented on the results of Anchorage quite ambiguously.
And here is the US position in this context. Marco Rubio confirmed the meeting and explained Washington's logic. He said that Russia and the US, as the largest nuclear powers, cannot abandon dialogue and therefore, yes, they will hold negotiations. He stated that no matter what, the US must have relations with the Russian government. The wording of the US State Department basically comes down to the idea that not communicating with Moscow is unreasonable, while the US remains open and intends to do so again, to make a constructive contribution to ending the war. It should be noted here that Washington is openly saying it does not intend to break off contacts with Moscow despite the war and the lack of progress. This is the position we'll work with moving forward. Then again, it's always been like this. Even with these feral Russians, unfortunately, a dialogue is necessary just to see what these savages are planning, how they think, and so on. Well, it's a kind of research. We need to understand what this creature actually is. That's why, yes, the dialogue with them continues. Well, it's already obvious that negotiations may take a new path, and now the Kremlin is raising the stakes again. What is happening now is a clear sign that the Russians have seen a new opportunity to stall for time again, supposedly by holding negotiations. Let me explain what I mean. Bloomberg, citing 3 sources close to the Kremlin, outlined Vladimir Putin's new negotiating position, and it turned out to be tougher than before. This is generally a classic Russian tactic in negotiations, escalation for the sake of de-escalation. So what does Bloomberg report? First, Russia is no longer going to return any of the occupied territories to Ukraine as part of any agreement to end the war. Previously, Moscow claimed that Ukraine should give up Donbas in exchange for the return of the captured areas of Sumy and Kharkiv regions. The Russians, let me remind you, called this the spirit of Anchorage, but Washington denied that any such agreements existed. Now the Kremlin has completely abandoned this scheme and cynically claims that it's the Americans' own fault because they violated some kind of deal, which, let me remind you, didn't actually exist in Alaska. Second, Russia intends to keep the occupied areas of the Sumy and Kharkiv regions as a buffer zone. And now Putin claims that he will never return these territories, even if he completely captures Donbas. And that leads to the third key point. Vladimir Putin still seeks to capture all of Donbas, and he believes that negotiations can only resume after this goal is achieved. Well, that is, Moscow is only ready to talk about peace after it takes the entire Donetsk region. Although it's hard for me to imagine negotiations with the Russians while they are still holding parts of the Sumy and Kharkiv regions. Fourth, about the timing. One of Bloomberg's sources said that the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation once again assured Plyushevy of the declaration to the dictator Vladimir Putin that the Russian army would easily gain full control over the remaining part of Donetsk region literally by the end of this year. At the same time, a source connected to the Russian Ministry of Defense told the agency that many military personnel consider such a timeline unrealistic and say that mid-2027 is a more likely time frame. In other words, Vladimir Putin once again received timelines for capturing it that are unlikely to ever come true. Why has Vladimir Putin hardened his stance? And here Bloomberg names 2 reasons. The first one. The Kremlin considers the informal agreements reached at the summit in Anchorage in August 2025 to have been broken. Here it's important to note one very important point. Russians always conduct negotiations this way. That is, they make up some supposed agreements for themselves. They spent almost a year going on about these agreements. Then they admitted that they never existed. Now they're saying, they did exist, but the Americans violated them. It's exactly the same as when Vladimir Putin found a reason to start a full-scale war against Ukraine, claiming that supposedly someone in the West once verbally promised the Russians not to expand NATO to the east. No one ever promised that. There were no such agreements. But the Russians say they existed. They were violated. So now we have a reason to start a full-scale war. It's exactly the same here. Putin has already admitted long ago that there were no agreements in Anchorage. But that doesn't matter. He needs a reason. He says, well, yes, there were no agreements, but the Americans broke them. That's why I have a reason to abandon any negotiating position. And the second reason, this is Donald Trump's decision to support a bill to impose tariffs of up to 100% on the 5 largest buyers of Russian oil. It's like Vladimir Putin is retaliating against Trump for a sanctions law that hasn't even passed yet. Plus, the agency specifically notes the context that Putin has toughened his stance amid increased Ukrainian strikes deep inside Russia, including on unwashed Moscow. But we shouldn't let all this mislead us. Before each new round of negotiations, the Kremlin raises the stakes and makes the conditions as tough as possible in order to have room for bargaining. This is a classic Russian negotiation tactic. Let's remember what Vladimir Putin demanded at the beginning of the full-scale war. And what did he demand in 2023? What did he demand a year ago? And what is he demanding today? And if you connect the dots, you'll see that the position isn't getting tougher. On the contrary, it's gradually slipping downward. Let me remind you, in the first days of the full-scale invasion, this bold misunderstanding was sitting slouched in a chair saying, "Ukrainian army, let's talk with you, because some terrorists have started a war over there. Yeah, we'll take Kyiv in 3 days and so on, so there won't be a Ukrainian army will carry out denazification." You remember all that rhetoric. What has Putin sunk to today? He's creating buffer zones because Russia is burning. But as you understand, if the negotiations between Lavrov and Rubio in Manila are the public part, then there is also a secret part to such negotiations. The day before, Peskov didn't say that for no reason that the Kremlin is ready to negotiate with Europe, and here the president of Azerbaijan revealed the details. Ilham Aliyev, at a briefing with German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, said that a closed meeting of former high-ranking representatives of Russia and Germany took place in Baku from July 12 to 14. It was dedicated to finding ways to end the war in Ukraine. Here is a quote from Aliyev. "Our territory was used for such a meeting without our knowledge. I cannot comment on the details since we were not present at this meeting. However, flight data allows me to state that the secret meeting in Baku did indeed take place. If this meeting was intended to help end the war between Russia and Ukraine, we can only welcome it." And after the reports in the press, Aliyev instructed the State Border Service of Azerbaijan to conduct a separate investigation. But Chancellor Merz stated that he knows nothing about this meeting at all. Now, specifically, who was there? On the Russian side, the delegation was headed by Viktor Zubkov. He is the former Prime Minister of Russia and the current chairman of the board of directors of Gazprom. Valery Fadiev arrived in Baku with him. He is the chairman of the council under the President of Russia for the development of civil society and human rights, and Alexei Gromyko, he is the director of the Institute of Europe of the Russian Academy of Sciences. On the German side, there was Ronald Pofalla. He is the former head of the office of the Federal Chancellor of Germany, and Matthias Platzek. He is the former Prime Minister of the state of Brandenburg. God, I barely managed to pronounce it. And this isn't a one-time thing. It turned out that Zubkov has been regularly holding closed meetings with former German officials since 2024. The contacts are taking place through the former St. Petersburg Dialogue Forum, which was officially discontinued after the start of the full-scale war of the savage Russians against Ukraine. But here it's important to distinguish business meetings from negotiations on the political track regarding ending the war. This is an important point. And while Moscow is building bridges in Manila and Baku, it is also preparing a stab in the back. This is yet another reason why Marco Rubio should by no means trust the Russian horse Sergei Lavrov tomorrow in Manila. The head of the Center for Countering Disinformation at the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, Andriy Kovalenko, reported that Russia is preparing a false flag provocation against NATO countries. In particular, the Russian Federation may use drones disguised as Ukrainian ones to attack the Baltic countries and carry out provocations on Polish territory. The goal of such operations is to undermine trust in Ukraine among its allies, and the Russian GRU is responsible for preparing and carrying out these actions. And this, by the way, is not the first such warning. Let me remind you, a few days earlier, Polish Foreign Minister Radoslaw Sikorski, during his visit to the United States, also stated that Russia might attack a NATO member country, or simulate an attack on its own territory, and in both cases use specifically Ukrainian drones. Well, to get a pretext for attacking Kyiv's Western allies, especially Poland. Sikorski named Russia's failures on the Ukrainian front as the reason for such plans. Moreover, there is increasing talk now that rumors about mobilization in Russia this fall and about Putin being ready to open a second front. These are also elements of pressure on Europe with the aim of forcing Ukraine to capitulate through the Europeans. And now, when we have already gathered all the facts, let's analyze together how this whole negotiation saga will affect Ukraine and what the Kremlin is planning. First, despite the headlines about negotiations, there is no softening of Putin's position. The position has become tougher. Previously, there was at least some discussion about exchanging territory, but now Moscow is not giving up anything and is adding demands for buffer zones in the Sumy and Kharkiv regions. The condition for returning to the negotiating table is capturing the entire Donetsk region first. In other words, the Kremlin is not offering negotiations but de facto capitulation. But don't jump to conclusions. Second, the deadlines that the Russian Ministry of Defense promised Vladimir Putin for capturing the entire Donbass are considered unrealistic by their own military. And instead of the end of 2026, they are now mentioning the year 2027. And this means that Moscow itself cannot fulfill the conditions for negotiations. And this whole setup turns into a way to buy time. Once again, now Putin says no negotiations until I capture Donbass. But his military says we definitely won't capture it by year's end, so no capture in the next 6 months. And at the same time, Lavrov is trying to negotiate with Rubio, like we're ready for dialogue. Third, activation of all channels at once. Lavrov to Rubio, Zubkov to the Germans through Baku. And then there's also Peskov's statement about being ready to talk to Europe. All this is happening against the backdrop of what's going on inside Russia itself. Let me remind you of the context. Burning oil refineries and a fuel crisis. Wildberries warehouses burned down in 4 regions. Russian banks are factoring in a key interest rate hike due to inflation caused by the fuel crisis. Capital is slowly flowing out of Russia, and Trump supports a bill for 100% tariffs against buyers of Russian oil. So, Moscow is seeking dialogue not from a position of strength, but rather under pressure after all. The fourth point, and for us the most dangerous one. While all these negotiation gestures are taking place, the Russian GRU is preparing false flag provocations staged to look like Ukrainian attacks against NATO countries. The scheme is obvious. At the negotiating table, they pretend to be constructive, while the GRU strikes at the Baltics and Poland with supposedly Ukrainian drones in order to drive a wedge between us and our allies. If such a provocation happens during the negotiations, it could hurt our support in the West more than any statements. So this is an attempt to show, look, we Russians sat down at the negotiating table and the Ukrainians are hitting Europe with their drones on purpose to disrupt these negotiations. So what does that mean? They don't want peace. And fifth, the meeting in Baku shows that besides official diplomacy, a backchannel is operating through retired officials and Gazprom, through the closed St. Petersburg dialogue, and this has been happening regularly since 2024. Even Aliyev found out about this through flight data, and Merz publicly distanced himself from it altogether. This is one of those cases when people can discuss Ukraine's future behind its back. People who, in fact, were never even elected by anyone. The result? Tomorrow, July 23, Lavrov and Rubio will sit down at the negotiating table in Manila for the first time in 10 months and will discuss Ukraine. By this point, Moscow's position has become tougher. No return of territories, all of Donbass and buffer zones in the Sumy and Kharkiv regions. And negotiations will only take place after the complete capture of the Donetsk region, which even their own military doesn't believe will be finished before 2027. At the same time, Zubkov's backchannel with the Germans in Baku was exposed. Well, the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine is warning about planned GRU false flag provocations against NATO countries blamed on Ukraine. The conclusion here is simple. Russia is sitting down at the negotiating table now not because it wants peace, but because it's in a bad situation. Oil depots are burning, refineries are on fire, all the warehouses are being hit one after another, and capital is fleeing the country. And on top of that, it's possible that Trump will actually introduce new sanctions. At the same time, Russia is preparing a provocation to drive a wedge between us and our allies. That's why I urge everyone once again to approach such negotiations with the utmost caution. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.